This is Cybersound, your simplified and fundamentals-focused source for all things cybersecurity.
Welcome to Cybersound. I'm your host, Jason Pufahl, joined today by Michael Grande and Steve Maresca. Today we are going to revisit the predictions we made in 2025 briefly, just to sort of see how we did. I think that, generally we hit a lot of things correctly. Maybe a couple of things weren't as severe as perhaps we suggested. And we're going to talk a little bit about what we envision some of the bigger risks for 2026. I'll start because we do have a list that, we talked about the shift toward more aggressive social engineering and phishing using some of the tools that we have that maybe weren't here a handful of years ago, AI related. That we certainly were correct in predicting a greater utilization of those tools and in an easier way to dupe people. And we've already started talking about how we think, just generally speaking, misinformation is going to be a bigger impersonation is going to be a bigger risk in 2026, right? And Steve, you used that word supercharged.
We're hearing reports from customers right now that are actively experiencing real world attacks in ways that you wouldn't think are beneficial to a criminal from a reward perspective. They're not making money necessarily.
Is it part of the long game though, right? Are they
Probably.
constructing narratives that give them the opportunity to establish false trust over terms?
Almost certainly, yeah. I mean, there's been a huge shift in phishing campaigns, written emails, traditional phishing. That's probably AI agent driven on an automated way behind the scenes, where you're not packing all of the urgency and emotional appeal and everything that's normally expected into the initial email. Instead, it's amortized out over time across 10 different messages back and forth. And that lowers the suspicion level that people have because they're having a conversation with someone who's interacting in the way they expect. Then when the other shoe drops and they have a request, their credulity isn't, in a level that causes them to pause. They act.
Right.
And it's the same sort of problem.
I think about a few of the conversations that we had over the past several years with maybe some of the legislators from a state basis, talking about, regulatory efforts and trying to hold some of the providers accountable. I think that's the biggest surprise from my perspective. We talked about social media, is that with this prevalence and constant onslaught of doctored videos and sound and events, I feel as though there's absolutely no scale or watermark that's distilled upon it to say, hey, this is AI generated, or, we flagged it for some reason. I'm sure it does exist to some degree, but personally speaking, from some of the things that are puzzling when they show up in a feed or whatever it might be, it's remarkable to see how sort of it slips through the cracks, I guess, of some of the, at least on the media side. I'm a little concerned about that.
I have a theory there's regulatory capture involved here. I think that there's sufficient lobbying behind the scenes that any sort of attempt to add teeth to regulations simply is not occurring.
Yeah, I agree.
Other nations, in Europe as an example, they have well-structured fines and oversight bodies and reporting pathways and basic baseline expectations for behavior. If violated, there is a consequence. That doesn't exist here. And any sort of attempt to, project transparency doesn't really have a full-throated commitment from most corporate entities that are doing this stuff, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Look at how X has transformed from the Twitter days. All of the staff and hundreds of people that were employed for content monitoring and curation and pulling down the offensive stuff, they're gone.
Right.
They don't exist anymore. So what was present has been hollowed out. So we've gone backwards. in many respects.
And so we're calling this the 2026 prediction.
Yeah.
It's really more of the same. We how many times have we discussed, from a security awareness training issue, credential management and verification of identities, and understanding who you're speaking with, and trusting, verifying and trusting. It's all the same thing. It's just more difficult now to be able to do those things, because just to your point, Steve, you can play the long game, you can build trust over time, because it's not expensive to do anymore from a human capital issue.
Right. I mean, if we just use a very narrow view and think of the dollars from a context perspective to have an agent servicing a phishing campaign, for a conversation of a typical email length with an individual that's a target victim, we're talking about cents to target them from a context tokens consumptions perspective. If you're using public compute, it's wildly cost effective if you look at it from that lens. So why wouldn't an attacker do it?
Yeah.
Perhaps we do quick hits with things that we had in 2025, assess whether we've been accurate or not, and then shift into
how close to the marker that we came.
Yeah.
That's fair. We started with the first one and immediately segued into a 2020 prediction.
Yeah.
I
think we were. I was going to say, I think from one of the items that we brought up and still feels so, constantly in our face today is sort of this geopolitical atmosphere, sort of what's happening out in the world, state actors, bad actors, nation states being involved in different actions, maybe, developments, the war still waging in certain areas. I think we thought instability would mean sort of there'd be a lot more complex attacks and there'd be more sort of hybrid sabotage and disruptive campaigns. I don't know if we saw quite to the level that we expected. Maybe just that's like back to the long play, right? If it totally came true.
I think it's fair to say we're partially accurate there. I also think that there's probably some disruptions and outages that occurred in the last year that we'll find a year from now are explained as being exactly what we thought. But certainly it wasn't as high temperature as we thought it could be. And
that's probably somewhat, I'll call it mundane maybe. Some of these threat actors using sort of global incidents as a way to send phishing or something tied to that, which isn't that exciting or that really that unique. So less of the infrastructure outages, less of the disruption, and probably more of that more traditional, let's take advantage of news and see if we can get something to occur as a result of it.
Yep, agreed.
AI utilization by threat actors. Certainly we predicted it. We already spent about the time on it today. It's true in 25. It's going to be more true in 26. I don't know. There's much more to say about that one.
I do think, at least from a 26 perspective, voice cloning. We've talked about it repeatedly now, but the models that are coming out right now are so hyper efficient compared to what they used to be. I think we'll see an explosion of it. It's now relatively trivial to build an agent to sit on a phone call and engage in a realistic way. I can do it with 6 hours of effort. That's how straightforward it is. So
I don't want to paint a picture or suggest something, but I'm sure it's also sort of entered into the ethos of what's happening out in the world. But we talk about voice cloning. I always go back to the old when we were younger. I feel like it was more common of a thing. You free speech is one thing, but you can't yell fire in a movie theater, right? This was sort of this common phrase that everybody sort of understood the context of. I get concerned about just our public safety systems being overrun by false calls and reports.
Sure.
I think we've seen an increase in swatting. We see a lot of different types of events happening, and under the cover of an agent voice clone or someone in either a political position or well-known public position, that's a concern. I think about, obviously both from a school's perspective, but out in the general public trust outside of our private homes, sort of the dangers that are created from those things.
Yeah, it's relatively trivial to imagine that someone could be framed for something. A false report could be extraordinarily easily manufactured. People could be slandered with relative ease. There are all sorts of allegations that could be ginned up without much effort. Right. There's a lot of risk there, and it will be exceptionally difficult to refute in many cases, unfortunately. I think there are,
right.
Yeah, and I think there are some possible benefits in the discussions that I'm seeing in various corners from a language model perspective or a image generation, video generation perspective. Watermarking and fingerprinting is part of that conversation.
Yeah.
Seems like every other month it's people on board, companies on board, and then they backtrack and nope, we're not doing that. So I don't know what that will turn into, but it may help with this particular problem to ascertain whether there is legitimacy or not.
I think the next two predictions that we made last year, less AI based, more traditional security based. One was, is there essentially a security controls fatigue by end users, which is many controls will be put in place to help protect, then people either start to ignore some of the alerts that come out of them, or attackers find a way to circumvent them. I think the thing that jumped out was the how MFA was considered new-ish 10 years ago, now is completely mainstream and has gotten to a point now where it requires too much validation, right? You're constantly doing your second factor. You're constantly entering a number in to validate that who you are, because based on your locale and whatever, there's definitely a fatigue there. And I think people are now starting to pull. I don't know if they're pulling back. Steve, this is probably a good comment for you because you see it from so many clients. Are people pulling back on it? Are people resisting some of these technologies? Are you seeing more bypass?
I think it's fair to say that lots of orgs are at different places on that arc. Some have absolutely instituted number challenges or biometric platform authentications as an augmentation. Those did so in response appropriately to the threats that they faced. And I think that they had a period of relative tranquility because those controls were working. And then the cat caught the mouse to some degree. And now they are experiencing some really ugly bypass events where the numbers challenges are being proxied. It's possible to circumvent all of these things in some capacity, either through coercion, deception, technical achievements, and misuse of the tools in question. You name it. The fatigue is less so than you think it might be. There is a relatively high degree of finesse with a lot of these platforms, regardless of who we're talking about: Okta, Azure, MFA, Google, two-step verification, doesn't matter. Generally speaking, people are used to it. The issue is actually situational. If people are prepped to anticipate an MFA prompt, then it is a very, very low friction thing to deceive them into giving up access. So it's less about the technology failing. It's less about the fatigue. It's about the surrounding parameters that enable them to be willing to give up something they shouldn't. Generally speaking, these tools are still effective, but another wave of evolution and refinement is necessary. We're kind of at that threshold where I think we'll head more to the biometrics and platform side to appropriately safeguard people. That's where we are.
Yeah.
we've got our last prediction of 25 centered around the very exciting topic.
It's glamorous.
Third-party risk. Yeah, very glamorous. Third-party risk and vendor security assessments, which I logically pulls in a lot of the things that we've been talking about, right? As organizations expand and understanding and assessing your vendor and your strategic partners' posture and what are they doing and how are you mitigating third-party risk? Obviously, in mid-market and SMB environments, I think we were pretty accurate with that one as well.
Yeah,
I think it's an expression of both the tightening budgets and the heightened risk that these things become emphasized and more critical. There's less tolerance for error across all industries, and holding others to account formally is an absolute expectation. It's a business requirement for securing revenue. It's not changing. It's only getting more stringent. I don't think that's a net negative overall. It has encouraged and fostered good improvement in industries that have honestly been somewhat hesitant to invest. But I do think it's had other shifts of costs rising and simply, it's being passed on in other ways that may be perceived as a negative. Bottom line, it's a lot of effort. It's getting more so, and it's not going away.
So it's just, sure, Steve, look at me like, how come he's smirking? And
yeah, I was wondering.
So Michael said, talks about the prediction. My response was, yep. And then you waxed eloquently about all the reasons why it's a good prediction. I'm thinking, pretty funny. You took something that I thought was actually pretty mundane and made it pretty interesting, which I appreciated. Because my first reaction was simply like, yep.
You got that one.
Kind of boring.
This is kind of my job. After all,
it's your job. It was great. Right. I loved it. I was just thinking, I don't know how much there is to say about it. Then you found a whole bunch of good stuff to say about it. So,
well, I'm glad my stream of consciousness makes sense.
Yeah. Now repeat it. That's what I want you to do.
Not possible. I want to cover something really specific. We've actually seen poisoning of commodity inference platforms like OpenAI's ChatGPT to deliver malicious content to unsuspecting users. In November, December, there was a very interesting scenario where someone searching for how to increase disk space or remove data in OS X, if they search for that in Google, they would land on a transcript from ChatGPT that included directions that seemed plausible if you're a non-technical user to take a command and run it, that if you did so, resulted in something that was unambiguously, provably, verifiably a Trojan. And it doesn't look that way, but if you are willing to copy and paste something into a terminal because you're trying to fix the disk space problem, and I guarantee millions of people will do that.
Yeah.
It's from ChatGPT. It's not going to hurt me. It's a computer.
Right.
It's not malicious and not a hacker, but no, it was a Google ad that was well placed for some keywords for unsuspecting non-technical users to actually interact with instructions that seemed plausible and an outcome that was absolutely 100% malicious.
Right.
So more of that's coming.
Oh. And that's honestly, that's one of the big risks of AI in general, which is asking it questions that you don't have really any background in the topic, and you just have no trust to the result.
If it's right or wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, this is kind of one of the top of mind things for me is the whole, ability to misinform or misrepresent, which is, you're just seeing it so much now.
Well, this is a utility in the sense that it's artistic license with respect to the image to be conveyed. It's not one of those misuses of the same capability to misdirect, right?
So I had a long discussion where, Paul and a variety of other people, we were talking about, our people. I posited that it's a race to the bottom in terms of people's behaviors. If there was a some sort of catastrophic event, right? If power grids go down, if people feel like they're in a position where they have to take care of themselves, we will have sort of mass looting. We will have many people doing the wrong thing. And he argued that, people are generally good and we probably would come together. And I think there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. And I just don't believe that. But, and he kind of argued that, again, 98% of the people are good. And I think, unfortunately, it only takes 2% of the people to not do the right thing to basically have a significant negative output. And it's at a point now where I don't trust anything I see now on social media, because there's so many videos. Now they're not necessarily intended to cause major harm, right? Like watching somebody who generated the avalanche that theoretically sweeps all the cars off the highway on I-70 in Denver. Like, I guess, what's the big deal? Except it's so realistic and so difficult sometimes to discern whether you're looking at an actual, newsworthy event or if it's fake. And we're seeing more and more and more of that. So sure. It's creatively using the tools, but they're done so they can get more eyes on something that's sensationalized to drive traffic to whatever site for whatever purpose. I feel like if there's no clearer example of people's overall misuse of technology and the race to the bottom in terms of doing the right thing, I mean, it's social media. We treat each other poorly in comments. We talk to people in ways we never would in person. We generate fake news. We generate fake images. It's awful. I find it depressing.
Before, there was a statement untethered from citation, and it was the burden of the audience to then do research to ascertain whether it was real or not. Today, the author of the assertion is coupling it with what appears to be evidence,
right?
And that in and of itself is the problem. I have an example that's actually really tangible here. Trains in the UK back in early December, were canceled because of a generated photo of a bridge collapse. And, the authorities didn't know one way or the other, so they acted accordingly because something was spreading around, hypothetically showing something real, and they shut down a rail line. Now, that is a real-world impact from something fabricated. There are fundamentally more and more and more examples of that over time. It's not just salacious clickbait generating engagement. It's actually affecting the real world in an increasing way. I don't know what else to say other than it's dangerous. However, falsehood always flies faster than truth. There are a million variations of that term. It remains true, but people
until
are now,
it's not.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we're in an era where people outsource their cognition to other tools, and if it seems reasonable, they believe it.
For the 2026, one of our 2026 predictions absolutely is, the widespread misinformation, whether it's truly, for malintent or not, right? The example that you just used, Steve, has a negative outcome. Many of the things, they don't really, there's the trend, right? We're seeing the trend, so foolish, but the trend where the mother animal runs to the vehicle and drops their baby off into the car because it's being chased by a predator. Like, there is example after example of that trend. Like, how that got popular, I have no idea. But the first time I saw it, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's cute, that's cool. And then you realize, yeah, it's all fake.
But I think there's danger in asserting this is a future state. We've already passed that threshold. I like to cite the Overton window shifts in this particular regard from a journalism perspective. If you asked yourselves in 2015 to respond to a frankly now normalized, regular, everyday representation of misinformation that's occurring in the news, you would be utterly floored and flabbergasted. There are material damage accumulating out of the result of these things, even if they are as little things, tiny cuts. society is being fractured into tribal units that don't exist. Not really. They're manufactured. There are changes to the social contract in general, from government services to corporate commitments to hiring practices to firing practices, terminations that result from falsehoods. All of these things, there are a million different tiny examples, and I think we are becoming desensitized to the reality that we're already there. It just looks a little different and supercharged with imagery and videos.
It's the supercharged. I think that's the concern. I think that's the right word. 100%, right? We've been here for a while, and I'd say it was easier to understand, easier to see, sensationalized news or things that you just knew were somewhat ludicrous. I think now it's so pervasive in videos and sound in a way that wasn't before, that even people who probably weren't big news consumers or sort of legitimate source consumers are now starting to get pulled into things in a way that they weren't even before. But you're supercharged is the word. I think that is the perfect way to describe where we are today. I think that's the reason I wanted to put it on the list, because it's going to impact the social engineering things that we see, right? People are creating their avatars that respond in a way that's much more natural now, that looks, potentially much more realistic and can easily trick somebody. And they're building entire personas, right? They're creating LinkedIn accounts for these people with feeds that go back for a period of time. They can stand up a website quickly. So all the things that you might have used before to validate real versus not, so much quicker and easier to fool people. So I think, I like the word supercharged. I think it's spot on, the reason that I put that in the list.
Yeah. Bottom line, it's orders of magnitude more effort to discern real from illegitimate today than it was.
Yeah.
And you need to be a specialist to actually do it.
And I find I'm embarrassed. And I'll use that. I'll use the avalanche example, partly because my son went out to Colorado. So I was looking at some things and I saw this avalanche, and it took me 3 or 4 watches to see, there's a giant boulder that theoretically swept through all of the cars that then disappears a couple of frames later, and I didn't catch it. But I'm embarrassed that I had to watch it 4 times. And I'm embarrassed that I contributed to the success of the algorithm for the person who posted it. Like, the whole thing bothers me. And I find, and I'm not a huge social media. I don't have a big presence. I don't consume a lot, but I'm doing less and less and less because I trust it less than I did before.
There are no easy solutions here. Right. Critical thinking is a skill, and it erodes.
Right. And this feels about like the midpoint of our 2026 predictions. So why don't we stop here and pick this back up in a couple of weeks? In the interim, if people have any questions, we're happy to answer them. We're happy to incorporate them perhaps in a future episode. But in 2 weeks, look for part 2 because we've got more predictions to come.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Feel free to get in touch at Vancord on LinkedIn. And remember, stay vigilant, stay resilient. This has been Cybersound.